China is an incredibly distorted economy. The kind of paradox or the contradiction is, on the one hand, China is the second largest world economy, wields great influence on the world and wants to be a great stakeholder and wants to have great global influence, but it practically is a developing country on many levels. One big major distortion is still in the financial system. 80% of the social aggregate credit is intermediated by the banking system. That is one very common feature of a developing country market. In the U.S., 80% of credit comes from direct capital markets, right? Only 15% of that is in China. Now, I mentioned that as being fundamentally important because somehow we have the view, as we read Western press, that the state suppresses the private, the state wants to extort the private. I want to bust that myth a little bit later. But I will agree that there's an implicit discrimination that is very important towards the private sector, and that is channeled from the financial system. So when monetary policy or credit is channeled through that system, there are layers and layers and layers of financial intermediaries, the top layer being 50-some institutions, and the second layer being 2,000-something financial institutions, and each of them has a white list of who can they lend to and who they can't lend to. So that means the real economy, the real private sector, by the way, which is the driving force of the economy because they account for 80% of GDP, 80% of employment, and 80% of innovation, they don't have access to that kind of capital. It's always channeled to state firms or very connected, politically connected private companies. And so that institutional flaw is the reason why there's a lot of crowding out of private sector. There's, the private entrepreneurs feel that there's a big challenge and difficulty, and especially in bad times, they are the ones that suffer. But it's that institutional flaw that has created that implicit discrimination that is very hard to fix in the short run for a variety of reasons. Another distortion, migration. There's very little interprovincial migration. Less than 5% of the population can migrate to other places. Now, if you're a worker who lost your job in Massachusetts, in Boston, you can move to Texas and Florida if you find another job. That's not the case in China. Even compared to India, interprovincial migration is extremely low, and it's prohibitively costly because of the social urban protection, lack of urban protection, also the hukou system that prevents the migration. So calculations have found that if we were able to double that flow of people across regions, you're also able to increase productivity by at least 30%, and these are significant numbers. I want to mention that because if we just take a few provinces on the eastern coast, or just take the entire eastern coast of China, it's already a rich economy. Many of them have reached South Korea standards of living. What does that tell you? It tells you that China can do it. China can be a middle-high income economy. But what's dragging it is the central western provinces that hasn't really found its source of economic well-being. But all technologies and employment and skill, labor and education, all of that, and I'll come back to a very interesting anecdote, which I think is very telling, that can already be done and accomplished in China. So this anecdote I told you, I'm going to tell you, is a dinner I had last week in China with a party secretary from a very interesting city in the province of Jiangsu. It's not a big city in Chinese standards, but it is the size of Singapore. And it has, they're very modest. They said, maybe you can write about my story, but there's so many of them. That's the whole point. They have reached 35,000 of per capita GDP. Okay, the party, the provincial party secretary, the city party secretary, a woman, is supercharged. They have something like 500 German multinationals there. She said that once there was an intellectual property threat, and she garnered the judiciary and everybody around for a midnight conference and just was able to handle the situation and resolve it. No IP leakage whatsoever. She said, we want to open it up to all the foreign companies, all the private companies. She's talking to entrepreneurs everywhere, trying to bring them into her city very successfully. She's also trained tens of thousands of students, graduated from vocational training, retrained them so they can be the appropriate labor force for the factories that are in her city. And these students from poor families suddenly got 7,000 RMB, right after graduation per month, and they were just absolutely thrilled. That reminds me that governments can really do a lot. Retraining and retooling, and the lack of that in the U.S. was one of the reasons why the China shock was felt so strongly. My understanding of this part of the world is that there is significant effort. But I want to bring that this anecdote because it's what I describe in my book as the mayor economy. Okay, it's funnier in Chinese because 市场经济, the mayor economy, is very similar to 市场经济, which means market economy. That's why we make the joke. It's not as funny, but I think the mayor economy is a good enough captive title because China is not just a centralized system. That's what we all think. It's politically centralized, but it's radically economically decentralized. And that lies in there lies the fundamental success story of China's economy. It's all these mayors running around, the lady that I mentioned, since the 1980s. They're entrepreneurial. They're often risk takers. They want to bring in the best technologies and investments and capital, and they help the private entrepreneurs. Why do they help the private entrepreneurs? Because they are the best. They want to help the best, not the worst or the most politically connected, because by helping the good entrepreneurs, you're creating an entire ecosystem of success. They bring jobs. They bring fiscal revenue. And by the way, this city, more than half of the fiscal revenues comes from taxes, okay, not from real estate. They have very low GDP, debt to GDP ratio. So again, I'll come back to what we should take out from this story. They want to help these private entrepreneurs because then they create the retail sector. Then even the real estate that they own is worth more. They are building mini Silicon Valleys all around China. And it's only useful if you help the good ones, the productive ones. And so they do that. They don't just help one or two, they help thousands. And so if you look at a picture of the distribution of unicorn companies in China, they're spread all over, with exception of the western, certain central provinces, but really not just in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, as you all know. Even in a second-tier cities, whether it's Wuxi, Wuhan, Suzhou, Hefei, many places you've not heard of, there are global quantum avenues running through, global companies. There are 300 EV cars all in China, and they're all backed by some local provincial party secretary, and they compete. So they're spread all over, and I think that decentralized nature, what I call the mayor economy, is really important to understand, not only to explain China's past growth, also to realize today's challenges, but also to look forward in the future.